human thinking follows rules, certain kinds of rules which are intrinsic to us. Then, and if that is what you call as logic, as Bolos very famously said, logic is the laws of human thought. And if the laws, if all of human thought follows certain laws, then what kind of a structure can capture it best? And to them, formal logic does it best. Symbolic logic does it best. So you already had a kind of entry of philosophers into the question of science by saying you know what it is to be a scientific philosopher if you know two things, and I think all of them are united on this, with due apologies to all the Hegelians. To all of them, it was clear, they said, don't read Hegel. That is first thing you want to do scientific philosophy. And secondly, what you do with scientific philosophy is to do this kind of introducing formal logic, changing the kind of language games that you play. Now this is so central that even today you have the same responses to philosophers and scientists. If you go to a scientific community and if they listen to a philosophy talk, or they read a text, they will say, why are you so verbose? Why are you going on talking? Why don't you make a point? Which is true, right? I think it's become so endemic. I mean, I have not seen in all my engagement with this community for so long that a community hasn't said this. And I think they are right in some sense, in the sense they're making us ask a reflective question about language use, why we use the language that we do, how we use the language that we do. But at the same time, we are not able to communicate to them the difficulties of the question of language. And if you ask them to read something like Heidegger, then their response becomes double than what they said. They're convinced that what they said was right. So there is this fundamental question which they are trying to make sense of, and scientific philosophy does this. Scientific philosophy thinks it can give us a kind of a framework in which to do philosophy, which maps these what they think are very important elements of science. Now, if you really look at the history of at this time of the scientific philosophy, I'm saying this because we really see how the analytic continental divide is actually not a very useful divide. So to understand this, we just have to see the fact that it's remarkable how many philosophers actually thought that philosophy was a science. In fact, Richardson points to the example of, he says, even Hegel would say this, but what he thought of science was very different from what these people thought of as science. And that was the difference he says he makes. But the crucial, to me the interesting point is, look at the philosophers who thought philosophy was a science. I mean, forget about the earlier people, I'm not particularly in this time period. If you put the list of people who were scientific philosophers, it would include Edmund Husserl, it would include Schelling, Dilthey, and then of course it leads up to all your analytical philosophers like Russell and so on. In this, what is interesting is around the same period, Husserl in 1911 writes his essay Philosophy as a Rigorous Science, and in 1914 Russell has his essay called Philosophy on Scientific Method in Philosophy. And people who, I'm using these two people because these are the two father figures of analytical continental philosophy, and they are both seeming to be working towards the same kind of a question and the same kind of a preoccupation and a problem. For Husserl, his repeated utterance that for him philosophy is the highest science, or what he sometimes calls the science of the sciences, is captured by a particular discipline of philosophy, or what becomes a particular discipline of philosophy called phenomenology. But for Russell, logic would capture what he would see as the most important aspect of philosophy as a science. So while there is that kind of a distinction, both of them think they are trying to make philosophy the science of the sciences. And it's interesting because, as I said, most of the people in continental tradition, when you read this debate between the analytical philosophers, again there's a great point of conflict between them, which is re-echoed in much of the major work of continental analytical philosophers today, which is about language, the lack of clear meaning, lack of definitions, lack of clarity, the long sentences which don't end, and so on. And it is, I think, so endemic that many of the criticisms which they have with the continental philosophers' language, as I said, are the same, which was just prior to the scientific philosophy period, and which the scientific philosophers are all responding to. Now, So I would say that, I mean, of course, yeah, one of the things I should mention also is that somebody like Kant also has this problem about philosophy. And, in his famous 3 questions which he poses in the introduction on the possibility of knowledge, he says, this is what I want to try and find out. How is scientific knowledge, how is natural science possible, or how is mathematical knowledge possible? And then he writes, how is metaphysics possible? And then says, no, I want to rechange that. And he says, how is metaphysics as science possible? He does it only for metaphysics because Kant believes that eventually his whole structure of his philosophy is to show how metaphysics is a science. You see, this preoccupation, when we completely cut out science from philosophical considerations, we actually miss, I think, this very large history of particular engagement, whether it's Kant, post-Kant, and so on. So, if you then ask me, therefore, what else did scientific philosophy did? I think they did 2 other very important sociological things. They consistently tried to separate philosophers from scientists. And remember that the idea of science itself, very interestingly, if you look at some of the major work on from science studies on how science as a top term comes to be, it actually is generated through 17th, 18th century Victorian journals, popular journals where people write about science. And you also know at the same time, scientists are, experimentalists are exhibiting their work, like magicians who charge money and then come and see a scientific experiment. So you had this whole process of socialization of science, bringing science to the people so they would accept that this is to validate that kind of science. And so it was very important to actually distinguish between the creed of scientists and the creed of philosophers. And for part of the scientific philosophy movement was actually to do that. But at the end of it, when they did realize that there had to be something different from philosophy and science, even within scientific philosophy, their argument is they generally tended to, which even Husserl tends to, is to say that their scientific philosophy is the general science of all the empirical sciences. All the other sciences become empirical sciences, or sciences which become subject matter for philosophy. And what philosophy would do is to give a general sign of all these different objects called physics, chemistry, mathematics, etc. So I think that kind of an entry into the analytical philosophical tradition through scientific philosophy made great influence on all these the growth of philosophy. I mean, we are still, when we read our philosophy, we are still reading that history. We are still reading responses to those questions which are happening, right? Then you might then of course ask, where did this fissure actually happen when it was so closely intertwined in terms of larger ideas? But remember that in terms of language, there was a great fissure again. In terms of language and so-called use of language, there was a great difference between analytical and quantitative philosophy. And if you ask them where it was actually split, so Richardson, for example, thinks that it is catalyzed by Heidegger. And it actually comes to Husserl, and again the final split happens when both Heidegger and Husserl recognizes that this aim of trying to be science is really not possible. I just thought it worth, since there are many Heideggerian scholars here, I know it would be worth reading a very short quote from Heidegger on scientific philosophy. What he says about that. It is very interesting because when we read his later utterances about science, you might find part of it surprising, but you will see that it is not that surprising. So in his 1925 lecture course, he talks about, he says, to quote him, in the middle of the 19th century, a well-defined scientific philosophy gained prevalence. The expression scientific philosophy has a threefold sense. The philosophy characterized itself as scientific. Okay, and again, remember, when you are hearing this, it's Heidegger. Okay? Three characteristics. One, because it's a philosophy of the sciences, that is because it's a theory of scientific knowledge, because it has as its actual subject the fact of science. And that's why he calls it scientific philosophy, because you're looking at science as a subject matter of philosophy. And second, because by way of this inquiry into the structure of already given sciences, it secures its own theme, that it investigates in accordance with its own method. Because this is a very important, I think a very, very important social studies understanding of science by Heidegger in 1925, when he says it is scientific because it acquires its own domain and its own method. and speculation aimed at world views is thereby avoided. A very perceptive comment about what later would become a very important part of defining what science is. And third, because it seeks to give a foundation to the various disciplines that are directed towards consciousness, etc. So he says this in 1925, but in 1927 he does a slight reversal. He incorporates philosophy as science within philosophy. He subsumes science within philosophy when he says that philosophy is scientific is implied by its very concept. He doesn't even want to acknowledge the fact that there are different kinds of things. What philosophy is doing is already scientific, and therefore science gets subsumed under it. And then later on, he moves on to much, as you know, much more antagonistic stance to the idea of science. And very interestingly, Husserl, who, though I'm sure many of you read Husserl, etc. here, I think many people fault Husserl on the fact that his phenomenological method is not really transparent, it's not repeatable, people don't know what to do and get the same kind of results that everybody does and so on. But very interestingly, as a lonely philosopher, Husserl in the end begins to feel that his work was not the fruition of scientific philosophy. What he thought in the beginning was that he was developing a scientific philosophy, but in the end he realizes what he did was the beginning of scientific philosophy. So it's a very radical departure from what he is actually moving away from the scientific philosophy and the so-called analytical traditions like Russell's idea. And he says in 1935, he writes this, he says, philosophy as science, as serious, rigorous, indeed apodictically rigorous science, the dream is over. And that, for Husserl to say that, is a very important step in his understanding of philosophy and science, and this relationship between philosophy and science. So I think in a sense you had this period where there was a serious attempt, and which influences philosophy. I mean, again, just to re-emphasize, especially to all of philosophy students, you are reading the results of this debate and dialogue today. If you want to really do a serious textual analysis, you can look at the different subsects of what people have written, whether it's on epistemology or metaphysics or ontology, and you will see this kind of a preoccupation which is playing out completely in this. What is it? So let me then, so there are very interesting questions actually about the role of language in science today, if not in philosophy. I think the question of what kind of language should philosophy be written continues to elude us. The philosophers are broken into communities which go independently of each other on their kind of work that they do. So if you look at philosophical logic, you look at formal logic, you look at the logic world, they seem to be doing things which are completely not in conversation with a completely different world. It's not just the preoccupation of the kinds of questions, it's also the way of doing things. And one of the best examples for that is some of the recent engagement between Indian logic and symbolic logicians. Graham Priest wrote a very interesting piece on, there are many such accounts, started with others, but one on the formalization of JNU logic. They give us some examples of what one can do, but whether these traditions are talking to each other, it's a very open question. It's as much as whether people can talk to each other from a mathematical text and a non-mathematical text. We are still in that kind of a situation as far as language is concerned. But on the other hand, science's engagement with language has become far more complex than this kind of a textual, monolingual engagement of philosophy. As I said, multisemiosis characterizes the very act of doing science and writing science. But more than that, today, much of our contemporary understanding of philosophy of science is radically changed because of what science does in terms of simulations. Mathematical modeling, analytical solutions of mathematical models are no longer the crucial, no longer in the sense, they are not very dominant paradigm in the doing of science, but major computer simulations of almost all the fundamental processes are being modeled on computers. It actually raises a very interesting question, and in fact, to me, that question is really at the, that's a question to me which captures this tension between science and philosophy, which is actually very well embodied in the simulation systems, which is that what is really the role of language? Does language largely represent, that as we tend to understand natural language, or does language have the autonomy to act? And when you phrase it this way, it sounds like a meaningless question. How can language have an autonomy to act? Humans can have an autonomy to act. How can language have the power to act? But you know, if you want me to put in a one-line summary of this major debate within science and philosophy, it is this: does language have the power to act? Now, language as power is again not philosophically meaningless concept. We have had long traditions, both in Western philosophy and in Indian philosophy, on the idea of language as power. There's a whole Shaktivada tradition behind language as power, and there is a whole question of utterances, how even you can understand certain kinds of Grice and Austin in terms of some notions of power and the capability of language to do certain things. But for science, the question of language as power is this, and that's just to give you, maybe this is where I'll end with, which is to just give you an idea of what they believe language does. Whether, how to analyze it, how to understand it is, I think, left to philosophers again. But what they believe is this, that if I describe a situation like this room in mathematical terms, or if I describe the world in mathematical terms, then it is that description which will open up new entities in the world, which will show me new truths about it. So this theoretical imagination, that it is through language that I can actually know what is there in the world, not through going and digging something and seeing if something is there. So very good example, if you look at fundamental particle physics, almost all the, for example, the discovery of quark. So scientists love to use as an example, because here were these scientists who used a mathematical model to then postulate that there are things called quarks. So the question, which is I think of philosophical interest, is this: how does language have the power? Forget about whether it's right or wrong. We're just talking about the language having. So you begin with a description of the room, and because of the powers of that language, it then tells you that actually, if you dig under this table, you will find 1,000 kilograms of gold. Right? It's only in terms of language, not because I have any other evidence for it. For the mathematical use in or the linguistic use in science, scientific discourse is about this capacity of language. This is what interests them. They are not doing it because they think mathematics is. How do they know mathematics works so well? They are. So to me, the most interesting philosophical question is: what is it about these mathematical operations, or about certain kinds of nominalizations, that given a description, it can open up the possibilities of newer and newer world, which you then test and say yes or wrong. I mean, there are hundreds of theories that have been thrown out, and maybe 2 of them have come up. But how is it possible? So to me, it's always a great fascination to go back, look at how they say quarks are there, and then they do this thing. What is it about the capacity? In other words, language does not follow the world, but language has the power to create the world. That question is a fundamental question. When scientific philosophers are concerned, why do they want to do scientific philosophy? One of the reasons they repeatedly come back to is science has progressed so much. Science has told us so much. We are still stuck with the same thing. It's amazing. Even Husserl makes that point. We have not progressed as much as the sciences. What do we do? There's great anxiety. Here are these people who are claiming every second day they're discovering something and doing something, building something. And these philosophers are asking, what is it? I mean, today, we would not ask that question, or we would ask it far more nuanced, in a more nuanced manner. But to them, that anxiety was there, and that anxiety was actually about this question: what is the role of language in discovering truth, not in representing truth? I think representation is an interesting question, but set aside in this conflict between language and philosophy and science. Can we find ways to understand this? I still think it's one of the most interesting questions in philosophy and mathematics, among other things. So the whole question about the applicability of mathematics and so on, or what Wigner calls as the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Now finally, my last point is this. Given all this, you might ask, why is it when we look at a particular tradition, European tradition, to do this dialogue between philosophy and science? You could do the same thing with much of Indian philosophy and science, but it leads to all kinds of questions. Did Indians have science and so on? But you could ask the same question, was Aristotle a scientist? So I don't think that's a very useful question to ask. But to me, again, a very important, interesting question is about this. For those of you who are interested in the question of language, if you really look at Indian philosophical traditions, if there is one branch which is I think one of the richest branches in Indian philosophy, it is the philosophy of language. And the kind of questions about language which you deal with are very, very interesting. So there is already a great scope in trying to understand how the question of language plays within philosophy and science. But there is an intriguing difference, and I want to just point out to this difference, that if you look at Indian mathematics and also Indian logic, there are very clearly, these are responding to questions of language. If there are any questions, we can talk about it. But there are very clear questions about what constitutes word, meaning, etc., and how these structures are developed as responses to that. But most interestingly, if you look at Indian mathematics, they do not seem to be doing this particular version of symbolic mathematics which happens much later in European tradition. Largely happens legitimized by Leibniz. So it changes the way we do mathematics and understand mathematics. But if you look at Indian mathematics, they are still in prose form, they are poetry, they are verse form, but they do one of the most exciting work in algebra. For example, the famous indeterminate Pell's equations, of course the standard quadratic equations, etc. Were all done as part of a mathematical tradition, which seemed to be so different from the mathematical tradition that we inherit from Europe. Now, given this question about language, and also very important to understand, Indian mathematical traditions do not have Platonism. They do not have the theological constructs of Greek mathematics, which influences European mathematics till much later. Cantor, one of the greatest mathematicians who discovers the land of paradise, description of infinite, transparent cardinals, thought that his discovery of mathematics was part of a long history and tradition of discovering the world of God. And that is something which is very central to European mathematics, or what we see as modern mathematics. For Indian mathematical terms, Indian mathematicians are baniyas, they are masons, they are measuring and building and doubling things. The question of Pythagorean conflict, for example, with irrational numbers doesn't happen, the question of religion doesn't happen, and the whole idea of Platonism doesn't happen. So therefore, the very large question it poses to science is, what does it make sense to say that you built a science out of this idea of mathematics? How then do you rewrite the question of language with respect to science in this context? So I've just really gone through like an express train through various themes. But as I said, part of it was catalyzed by what Babu wanted to do, which is to bring the question of philosophy and science to the question of language. And given the different backgrounds that many of you have come from, I thought probably it's very useful to just remind us, which of course many of the philosophy people know, remind us once more that how the whole discipline of philosophy and science are in constant dialogue and responding to each other at different levels. And if you continue that conversation today, then the question, if somebody writes a history of philosophy 100 years from now, then you'll have to ask, what does the JNU Colloquium add to that history? Thank you.
Thank you, Sundar, for this wonderful lecture. I'm sorry for this long vacation. I assure you next time it will be better room. And before we move into question and answer session, we can take a few questions. I just want to make an announcement. This we have recorded and it will be uploaded in online. We have a Facebook page. You will find it JNU Philosophy Colloquium. I invite all of you to join that. And then this is only a start, and we will have a colloquium every month during the semester. In fact, I discussed it, I forgot to mention that Prof. About this lifestyle. Then his suggestion was it should be sustainable. But the sustainability means it should grow, it should progress. That we will try our best in the future. So there will be a colloquium every month, and I expect all of you and your friends. And then we move to the question and answer session.
It's fascinating to listen to Sundar as usual. And first of all, I should congratulate and thank Babu Dalia for using this series of Colloquia. And I should also thank Professor Hori for promoting it. I think we desperately need something like this. And Sundar, of course, has spoken of so many things and with a lot of passion. In fact, it will take a long time to respond to every one of the facts that you spoke of, as well as the issues that we raised and the kind of positions that we arrived at. But they are all very valuable, of course. This kind of thing can sustain us not just for 1 month, but for 1 whole year. And that's the great value of it. Now, one of the first things that one can say is that not only we need, of course, the last part of the talk, not only we need the Indian philosophy, but we need philosophy of Indians as well as philosophy for Indians. That's the way I see it. And when one looks at some of the historical kind of backgrounds, what one can notice there that, of course, the question of mathematics in the Greek context is a large part of its geometry. Of course, that's what Greeks were concerned with. And the Indians were, of course, concerned with language in a major way. But the nature of that, nature of their dealing with language is very interesting. Very fascinating to see that. Because there's a parallel that runs between ritual action and action in language, as well as the Panini's grammar, for example, is concerned. You can see almost word-to-word categories being kind of repeated between ritual action, which is a religious action, worship, and so on, and the action that is central to the kind of Indian grammar, which is specifically the Paninian kind of grammar. So one has to, so that's something, and that ritual action, the point about mentioning this is that ritual action has got, ritual action which parallels itself in the action and drama, has to do with ethics, because ritual action has to do with the ethical possibilities that can arise from activity, ritual activity as well as linguistic activity. That's one of the starting points. But it is true that later on people translate this problem into problems in logic, so that you don't find ethics coming there. One of the major problems there. Later on, in the context of the Western kind of sciences and logic and so on, it's not that ethical action which gets foregrounded, but it is the logical possibilities implicit in the nature of the argument itself. Nature of arguments themselves. And then when one goes on further on, of course, Greek grammar is coming, Greek language and Greek grammar comes from, not so much from theology, but from mythological arguments. And the grammar is written on the basis of the text of Homer. So it has a very literary kind of orientation. This is why language is so central to the Greeks. In a way, language has never been so central to the Arabs or the Indians. Of course, it is important, but it is not, doesn't have that amount of centrality that it has in the Greek context. So, Homer's grammar is the source of Ganesha's Thras's first Greek grammar. It's called Techne Grammatike, the art of writing, for that matter. And in the medieval European kind of context, you have theology in a major way, right? And logic in relation to theology becomes important. And I think you very nicely narrated the emergence from medieval to the modern, and that's fascinating. And this, I think there are two things that one might like to focus on there. One is the emergence of Reformation. That is when there is a shift from clericalism to book. That's where Luther comes in, Martin Luther. And then the next response is to say that even book is not enough. You need to depend on reason. Either experience in the case of Bacon, or reason in the case of Descartes and later. There are two moments. One is the dethroning of the priests, which is very important, very central to the problem. And the second is the dethroning of the book, because book cannot provide knowledge. You need to depend on either the worldly experience or mental reason, or rationality itself, which is entirely innate to begin with, at least, And I think when you come to the Enlightenment period, I'm sure Bati would know that part even better than me. There is the major tension there. On the one hand, there's Cartesian kind of rationalization to transform Kant, and then there's a reaction, and that comes from that reaction in the open kind of manner comes from Herbert. but in the in a subdued kind of manner, the one who kind of develops it for Herder against Kant is Hamann. All right. So that historicist, linguistic question of religion and folklore, literature, and so on, are all in a major way brought to the forefront by Hamann, and followed up by Kant's most favorite students. But Kant was very upset that his number one student went against him. He said he has too little imagination and less of reason. This is the complaint that Kant made against Herder. And then you find this whole philosophy of history developing, partly from Hamann, but much more from Herder, and then Humboldt, and even in a much bigger, fully blossomed way in Hegel. But then you're absolutely right in saying that in the mid-19th century, there's a reaction against that historicism of Hegel particularly. And that comes, I think we can debate on the term that we can use here. You have put it as scientific philosophy, but then it actually appeared as philosophy of science. All right. So you have philosophy of history, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of logic, and there is philosophy of science. And the person who was mainly instrumental in bringing forth the philosophy of science was Auguste Comte in France, the founder of positivism. And positivism is a central moment in any philosophy of science. You cannot set it aside. You cannot talk about what is happening in today's world without positivism, which is the founding moment of today's philosophy of science. And that philosophy of science will manifest itself in so many different ways. And one of the most important manner in which philosophy of science is behaviorism. Behaviorism is one of the kind of the longest spreading kind of scientific movements in the Western context. Beginning with, of course, with Comtean ideas, but then developed initially in Russia by Pavlov and by Watson in the United States, and the whole of American academic program become behavioral or behaviorist and so on. So in all this, I think one still has to ask the question of the importance. And of course, when Russell comes and Brentano's contribution in Husserl and so on and Inaugural, they're all reacting against positivism. Right. They're all trying to make a correction to positivism, to positivism and to behaviorism. Right. We don't want behaviorism. And there's an emphasis on what is happening at the level of logical systems in the mind, and logical systems as such, and logical systems in the mind and so on, so logical positivism, logical empiricism, and Husserl's phenomenology, which is initially in much more abstract terms about ideas and so on, abstraction from the knowledge experience to a scientific system based on ideas and so on, all that is taking place around that. But that's all reacting very strongly against positivism, which is the philosophy of science, and behaviorism, which is the practical application, which is the most potent and dangerous form of practical application of positivism. And so therefore, when one talks about the language science philosophy problem, apart from the one that you traced, in terms of mathematics and language as such, there's a whole tradition that comes from from the Romantic period, which has its foundations in Condorcet, Condillac, and Destutt-Tassi, who wrote this book called Elements of Ideal. So you have, and that has its traces, to a certain extent going back to Locke. The idea of language appearing in terms of science, as idea as science, all right. And science is a manner of trying to say that if the way we understand the world, and that science appears in Charles Sanders Peirce, the great American mathematician. He developed his own semiology. So the way we understand the world in terms of logic or otherwise begins with the way we interpret science. All right, the way we form science, the way we understand science, the way we interpret science. That goes back to John Locke in the British context. All right, and that has its continuity going into 20th century. And that one of the things that comes up there as a kind of response to analytical philosophy and behaviorism is not only what appears as phenomenology with Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger in a completely different way, is structuralism, all right. And you have structuralism, which brings back emotional science of DNS, and how language is constituted in terms of science. What is its cognitive side? What is its social side? All right. And that social side is what a lot of social scientists, for example, social science or science, social science hermeneutics, and so on, and as well as phenomenology. A lot of social scientists take that up, and they would actually say that through language, one of the main currents of that is that through language there are systems being formed, social system, constitution, and so on. And also through language there are ideological systems. Yeah, I'll just take one moment. Ideological
Please
systems
carry on.
formed. And that becomes a major kind of area of the tension. And in that conflict, the tension and conflict, there are major figures like Foucault, all right, and Deleuze, Derrida, and so on, alongside with Jean-François Lyotard and so on. So there's an entirely different manner of approaching language, which has been very productive in the field of humanities and social sciences. So we have to deal with that. Of course, this trajectory in itself is useful that you actually traced. But we need multiple kind of trajectories here in order to make our project richer. That's at least that's the way I can think of it. But this enterprise is absolutely fascinating, and a lot of very, very useful ideas actually come out of your project. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as a true scientist, I will be very specific. I'm a biologist, and this whole issue of philosophy of science and everything that I talked about, mostly people are concentrated on theoretical physics, mathematics. When it comes to biology, I think people haven't looked at the language particularly well. But particularly since, in last few decades, people are talking about mathematical biology, that biological thing, life processes, even the life itself, can be defined by mathematics. It's an issue that has not been. I'm one of the people who do a little bit of work in this area. I find the language is there, the language of description of a biological phenomenon in mathematics. Really something very intriguing. And I think philosophers should look at these issues. A person like you who has actually seen both sides of the world. That will be interesting to actually look at this.
Okay, let me start with your question. I think, yeah, you are very right. The early philosophy of science, especially over the last century, even Duhem, has been very focused on, they were all very fascinated with relativity, quantum theory was a major entry into philosophy and so on. In fact, like biology, there's also not very interesting work on philosophy of classical physics. Like the same question of axiomatization of classification, the same kinds of problems. But in biology, there has actually been tremendous growth in the last 10, 20 years in philosophy of biology. It's become very popular. There are separate philosophy of biology groups. And among one of the very important questions there is about language. There are also, for example, one major debate in philosophy of sciences, how biology differs from other sciences, in that laws in biology are not like laws in physics and chemistry. And there are no the so-called fundamental laws, universal laws, and so they are only phenomenological laws. How do you make sense of laws? Studying laws in science is a major industry in philosophy of science. So this question of philosophy of biology in that is one very important thing. Secondly is a question of natural kinds. And that's a very important work with a lot of people, including analytical philosophy, working on it. What kind of properties belong to the world? What kind of natural kinds? Is there an entity called tiger, which is a natural kind of the world, etc. And there is, that has also been largely catalyzed by philosophy of biology. It of course goes back to Aristotle, genus, species, distinction, and so on. So there is some interest in that. But the question about language, as you say, is a very problematic question in biology because it doesn't outwardly do the mathematics that the others do. So when people would ask, why is it even science in that sense? Is it just method or what about language? Now, my argument to that is that if you look at a biological text, then you will make as much meaning of it as a mathematical text. That is, the words in the English words in biological text are not at all in English. They are not English words at all. They are just technical terms. They could all be proper names, for example. They function as if they are all proper names. And you could read a whole sentence which says Sundar Sarukkai, France and Manjari, full stop. And nobody knows what it means. In a sense, it looks like a sentence, but we read it as if it's a sentence, but they're all meaning very separate in a technical sense. So biological text, and I would really like your help on this. I'm sure you can show some examples of biology, that it's so difficult to read. And again, if you ask what are the English words doing there, they're all place fillers. Totally, no valueless place fillers. If you actually drop it off, you're only, so I would say a biologist who's reading the text, technically, is dropping all the English words in between. Is, the, and, or, you're just looking at these main thing and mapping it. I mean, that's just a cognitive thing. So my question is, would that function like a mathematical? Not symbolic, but in some sense like a technical language at least, if not mathematical language. But this is a very important thing. I'm sure we should find some very interesting discussions on this and inquiry on this. There is, by the way, just about language, there's now some very interesting work on the genomic mapping thing and the question of language of genomic mapping. What are the questions of language?
That's something that I do a lot, but I use mathematics also to look at genomics.
Okay. So there's been some discussion in philosophy of bias. And Franson, thank you so much. I think you have really opened up this debate, which is what I think the whole thing was. So yeah, I was, as I said, I was focusing on mathematics for one primary reason, that it seems to have influenced the major philosophers, and how do we engage with that question today? That was the trajectory. And I'm particularly very, not sympathetic. My own work is also much closer to the semiotic question. Even going before Locke, from Roger Bacon's very seminal work, because there is already, you see something which is this inferential mechanism of Bacon, which is like in Indian logic and so on. That's actually a very fascinating thing to do. And I hope definitely those are things which this should continue to do. The point about the scientific philosophy is the term which they use. They in fact start a journal called scientific philosophy. I'm not using the word scientific philosophy. In fact, Richardson maps out the whole history of the scientific philosophy. Heidegger refers to it as scientific philosophy. Husserl calls it a scientific philosophy. So this is what I think they are called. They try. It was like a movement. They had a journal for it. Some Abhinoy, somebody was the first journal, but Ernest Mach becomes the second editor. So there is part of a tradition where they thought they were going to make this kind of a scientific philosophy. But you are very correct. It eventually reduces to methodology of science. They couldn't do much more than that. So they began with grand claims of what they wanted to scientific philosophy, but eventually it just reduced to even methodology, not even the larger philosophy of science. But you're right. If you look at the kind of Popperian philosophy of science, it just sort of all becomes
scientific method.
Yeah, it becomes just what is a scientific method. But I think the interesting question which they just still asked, which influences Husserl a lot, even in his Crisis of the European Sciences and so on, which is what? Which is philosophy as a general science in which the other sciences are empirical sciences, and which I am able to bring together under the larger question of a general science. Which means I can ask the question, like Husserl does, of or make the point that science can describe objects in a particular way, but it does not understand what those objects are. What is the meaning of those objects? I can talk about objects' interactions, but the larger question which he poses in terms of the object and so on. So that is still there. So I think you can see that trajectory there. And the point about mathematics, again, very interesting question, which again, where you are right, where the early Greek was about geometry, but very important was also arithmetic. Because you see, this geometry arithmetic is what upholds the whole theological doctrine. Because geometry begins to stand for the omnipresence of God, and arithmetic for the eternality of God. And one of the most famous proponents of it was Newton's teacher, Isaac Barrows, from whom Newton gets much of his ideas on space and time. To whom, space and time, which, as Newton says, are the sensorium of Godhead, so absolute space and absolute time. And he is drawing from this idea that geometry represents the quality of God, but omnipresence, and arithmetic represents eternity. So that influence is very interesting. But to me, actually, I came across this question when actually I stumbled upon when I was reading Badiou long time back in JNU, and my question was, why aren't they also concerned about mathematics? Now, Badiou is using set theory and some null sets and stuff. I don't even claim to have understood even that 2 lines of this. But my question is, what is this concern with these people in mathematics? Okay. Right? And so that is something which interests me in seeing what are the new kinds of, whether it's functors or sets or mappings and so on. Why is that so important to some of their most important writings of major philosophers today? And what is the notion of mathematics that they're using? They're not doing mathematics. They're not talking about symbolic manipulation and calculation. Why is the idea of mathematics so central to these people? So I'm trying to largely figure that out in my larger thing. And finally, on the rituals point, again, very interesting. It reminded me of something which I already said, which is connected to the symbolic thing. Fritz Stahl has his whole claim when he reads about the Vedic rituals and so on, talks about the meaninglessness of rituals. And when you look at the Mimamsa tradition, the question of rituals is so much associated with power, the capacity of language to have power to do certain things. And that, maybe there the connection of ethics is there a link. And the question of power of utterances, etc., right? What is very interesting is when mathematical symbolization happens, it is the same act which in my view happens, which is you take, all of mathematical symbolization is, let F be force. Now when you do that, you are actually stripping the meaning of a word like force and replacing it with an alphabet, which is in principle meaningless. So this shift from the meaning of language, the burden of meaning which is present in language, to meaninglessness of ritual symbols, in some sense what Fritz Stahl connects to the meaninglessness of rituals, actually leads to what we see as modern through Leibniz and this universal characteristic also. That's I think another track. I'm just adding to another track what we see. So there's a lot of very exciting things to do on these questions from different things.
Two words you've I've not heard in this lecture. I'm particularly confused regarding these 2 words. One is realism and another is social constructionism. And do these 2 words make any relevance to today's talk? Because these are 2 words which we as students of research keep hearing, and we can't make sense whether to relate these to the social sciences realm or to the science realm, and when we get surprises that yes, even these words are used for scientific realm also, the natural sciences also, then creates a lot of confusion.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, these 2 words are great import to this question because they're both connected to some question of language. Now, the question about realism is, if you take one commonsensical realism, there's a word outside of you and independent of you. But then when you describe the word, you're describing it through language. Let's say when you use language to describe it, then how do you know that the language matches it? So that is the basic question. I mean, early Wittgenstein picture theory, for example, modifications to it. I mean, all philosophers of language are eventually at some level trying to make sense of this question. Okay, so whether that is true in this context of science and philosophy is also very important. I mean, it holds. But I think there are new challenges which are posed, especially in the context of scientific realism. Because, the question about, for example, realism of mathematical entities. This is also a point which I think Richardson makes when he says, when the analytical philosophers like Russell and others try and emphasize the question of empiricism, what they miss out is that when it comes to the mathematical descriptions, Frege or Russell, etc., they have nothing to do with the empiricism. The question of Platonism plays a very important role in it. So this is something which is still an open question. What kind of realism is to do as mathematics? What is the realism associated with mathematics? Is there any notion of realism? Platonism is one assumption or one theory. I find it very difficult to believe in the side. But without it, a lot of science would collapse in the sense of what are called ontological commitments mathematically. Very interesting work in philosophy of mathematics is there on that, by the way. So the question about realism of mathematical entities is one question. Second, the question of existence, the realism of theoretical entities still remains a very important question in philosophy of science. I mean, do electrons are they theoretical entities or real entities and so on. And then you know, and then various kinds of larger universals which are used in science, are they real, are they not real? So there are, I think, you know, in the level of realism, there are various types of realism, and any question of language will be functioning with that. Social constructivism seems to be far more closely related to language, because it seems to be that the social construction happens with the language that we use. You know, the language makes the world, etc. But again, I think there are enough very powerful arguments to say, like for example, the theory-led view in philosophy of science, that theories also influence what you see, and it's not completely independent of the language, the concepts, the theories that you hold. So I think they are very much.
There are 4 questions. We've done 3 questions.
Yeah.